This is Dan Riley for Sports Talk on Passionate World Internet Radio. With the Olympics winding down and college football season hanging around the corner, I figured it's a good time to not only put a myth to bed, but explore exactly why the NCAA operates the way it does. It's actually quite a story, and it shows, well, there is a connection between the Olympics and NCAA football. It's not what you think it is. It has to do with what's actually a huge myth regarding the ancient Olympics and the cold hard truth behind why the NCAA has had an amateurism model. I've currently been reading a book that came out in 1989. It was called The 100-Yard Lie. It was written by Rick Telander. And it explored exactly why, even back then, the NCAA was making so much money and promoted the amateurism ideal in college athletics. And it also explored a lot of the corruption and stuff like that. We love to say that the ancient Olympics were amateur events. A lot of historians have admitted this was not true. That a lot of Olympians in ancient Greece competed for cash prizes. A lot like the winner's bonus that goes to the winner of the Super Bowl. You're probably curious as to where that myth came from and why the NCAA held on to the myth of the ancient Olympics in order to justify what they do, given they've basically operated college football as a sweatshop for decades now. According to Telander, the idea of amateurism, as the NCAA promotes it, doesn't go back to ancient Greece, which were actually professional events, but Victorian England. Now, you have to understand, as Telander writes in the book, that Victorian England had a lot of mores designed to keep the wealthy an arm's length from working people and poor people at all times. The extremely wealthy of Victorian England didn't want the average working person showing up at their school, at their workplace, or what's most important to this podcast, they didn't want working people or poor people to show up at their athletic clubs. That's right. It had to do with the fact that the obscenely wealthy absolutely loved that their athletic clubs, where they could play croquet, tennis, badminton, could only allow the obscenely wealthy. According to Telander, in the 1870s, the British Amateur Rowing Association put in a rule stating no person is an amateur who is or ever has been by trade or employment for wages a mechanic, artisan, or laborer, or engaged in any menial duty, end quote. So obviously, only the filthy rich could apply to that club. Clearly, anyone who had to play archery, tennis, or badminton for money was a working person who had to make a living. The wealthy simply wanted to segregate their athletic clubs according to social class. And to do that, they promoted the myth the Greeks played for love of the game, which they didn't, and also promoted amateurism in these sports because obviously a rich man can truly afford to play for the love of the game. Telander writes that this weaseled its way across the Atlantic to our major colleges because back in the 1800s, very, very few people went to a lot of these colleges. Yale, Harvard, Princeton. These schools would only have about 150 people in them, and the only people who could afford to send these kids to these places were the wealthy people. These big four-year universities were too expensive for other people to go. These places back then, you had to understand, were very, very conservative, unlike now, and operated with religious affiliations run by clergy who were intolerant of, quote, pleasures of the flesh, including sports. You're probably wondering how sports worked its way into these places then. Telander points out that students at Yale were operating a sports program like football and making a lot of money doing it. Apparently $2 million in today's money. That's when the faculty of these schools realized that their students were making a lot of money behind their back. But they couldn't justify sports that operated for profit at these big elitist universities that only welcomed the wealthy back then. As such, knowing that for-profit revenue-producing sport couldn't be really justified in these places, they instituted rules that not only could athletes not take money or any other gifts, but they were only going to be given a scholarship. It had to do not with ethics or morality, but keeping alive the myth that these were places of virtue and making sure they could keep student athletes away from their new pile of money while promoting an ideal that the wealthy in England had been promoting in Victorian England. These rules have been around for 100 years now. Okay? In the end, it has to do with not only schools being able to justify exploiting workers and making a big load of money, but it has to do with elitism. The idea that only a wealthy man plays for the love of the game. Yep. Telander's book, to me, exposes a cold, hard truth. It was never about protecting the purity of college football or college basketball, exploiting young men for millions of dollars while refusing to pay them. And for the record, a lot of these young men have been African American for decades. And ironically, these schools are very, very progressive, quite hypocritical. But it has to do with making sure sports stays away from poor athletes. And that the obscenely wealthy running college sports can stay on their big pile of cash. Let's remember that the next time we hear some college coach complaining about name, image, and likeness payments. The sad truth is, amateurism in Division I college sports is a throwback to the days when the wealthy made sure that their games and their sports could stay out of the hands of the poor and working people. In the end, by exploiting a false myth that the ancient Olympics were amateur events, our major universities in the United States have indeed run to help out an ideal designed to protect the wealthy at the expense of student athletes. Also, they could profit off an 18-year-old's athletic ability. That's why amateurism needs to go in college sports. It has to do with elitism and protecting the wealthy. It has nothing to do with ethics, morality, or protecting sports purity. That's something we should all be concerned about. This is Dan Riley. Thank you so much for tuning in, and so long.